we're about 2 weeks out from Election Day now, and the two presidential candidates vary on how they want things to run in many ways, including how we are all taxed. Charlie Heid with CLA is with us this afternoon to break down some of it for us. Yeah, sure. I think, everybody says, you vote with your wallet, right? We want to know what kind of impact this is going to have on our bottom line as families. So let's talk a little bit about the differing proposals when it comes to these candidates. You've got a whole list of them here, but I feel like a lot of people talk about, taxing the rich, So what are we looking at in terms of, income taxes?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that people need to understand is there is, under our current law, which is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's relevant. You need to understand that because that comes up a lot in the discussion on these tax plans because that is set to expire at the end of 2025, certain provisions. And so as we have learned about the proposals from both candidates, they refer to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So you got to understand
what that is to begin with.
Correct. So, when you think about individuals, marginal tax rate. We all know from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that the rates were reduced across the various levels of income. But a great example is the top rate is at 37%. When it expires, that top rate goes back to 39.6%. And that's relevant because Vice President Harris, in her discussion, she has indicated she wants that rate to go back to the 39.6. Former President Trump, in his proposal, wants to make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. So, and that's a differential. Then when you think about individual taxes, those are marginal. Then you have capital gains taxes, which is the one that you always hear about, taxing the rich. So that one right now it goes from 0, 15 to 20% under the current act, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What Vice President Harris wants to do is she has said she wants to take that top capital gains rate up to 28%. And then there's another piece out there called the net investment income tax. This was part of the Affordable Care Act. It funds health insurance. That is 3.8% currently. Vice President Harris has said she would like to take that to 5%. Now, when we talk about former President Trump, he hasn't really commented on those two specifics, which you might assume that he is really thinking just Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So
he just wants to keep that permanent. So that's one.
Those are
area
the big ones that affect,
Yes, and the ones that we think about a lot, but then we talk about once we get into, work. We've heard a lot of people talk about tip income and taxing that and overtime wages, things like that. What are the proposals there?
So tip income and President Trump came out with the idea of not taxing tip income. Well, then Vice President Harris, she liked that, and she gave him credit and said, "I like his plan, and I would agree with that. I think that's a great idea." Then he one-upped her and said, well, let's get rid of taxing overtime. There's been no comment from the Harris camp on that, but those are the two that have been thrown out. Now, there's a lot to work out with that, but those are two concepts.
All right. So there you go. They kind of agree on one thing there.
One thing, correct.
Now, in terms of tariffs, we hear a lot about that because we hear about inflation and how much things are costing. So tariffs kind of play into that, right?
Correct. And so from a tariff standpoint, you've got Trump has said he would like to have a 10% tariff on all imports coming into our country. But if those imports are from China, he wants a 60% tariff. And on the Harris camp, they have said nothing on tariffs.
All right. So of course they're going to differ on a whole lot of things, and we had, a breakdown of most of that. And of course you all have information as well, at the firm if people are trying to get more information, because as I said, we tend to vote with our wallets, right?
We do, and I would encourage anyone to educate yourself on the two candidates. Go out to their websites. It's out there. You can see it. And, but the one last thing that when you think about this, either one who wins can set the direction for a plan. But remember, Congress enacts tax legislation. So it really comes down to who controls the House and the Senate.
So you have to vote that way as well, likely as well.
Yep.
All right, well, we'll wait and see how it all shakes out. Thanks for being here to break some of that down for us, because a lot of it can sound like a whole lot of mumbo jumbo for a lot of people. Thanks for being here.